Welcome to Kids Education and Mental Health Network, a nonprofit organization to help children in the Solano County area who have mental, learning, or social disabilities. Today, I'm honored to talk with Jackie Jones, a special education teacher of 20 years. Jackie, we have some questions for you today.
Good.
So, one of the questions that many parents want to know is, why is my child struggling in school?
Well, first I think I'd like to relate to the question of struggling. What does that really look like in a child? I think in an elementary age school child, it looks as though they might be not making the academic expectations that one would hope for, or they might be hiding work from you and not bringing it home. As an older child, I think sometimes it leads to junior high and high school students cutting school for no apparent reason, at least no apparent reason on the outside. And I believe that's all related to the fact that they are really struggling at school. Some of them get headaches, stomach aches, and don't want to go to school, and you just absolutely don't know why. So obviously as a parent, it's your job to find out what's causing the struggling to go on inside them. So I think that one of the first ways to do that, and I might add sooner rather than later, is to contact, obviously first the child's teacher, and then contact the principal. And as it stands within a school frame, if a teacher thinks that a child is struggling, they're going to call an action team meeting, and that typically might have a special ed teacher there, a principal, or an administrator of some description, but not the parent at this point, and the regular classroom teacher as well, or a group of teachers if it's a high school or junior high. And they discuss what's going on and what they should do next in terms of procedure with the child that they see struggling in the classroom. If that doesn't happen and a parent becomes the advocate for the child, then they hold a student study team meeting, and that is where the parent is actually asked to come to the school and meet with a team of people, usually the classroom teacher of the child, a general ed teacher, an administrator, potentially somebody in the special ed field, and you come together and you're asked as the parent to give the strengths and the weaknesses typically of the child, and then the classroom teacher says what they are seeing, the parent says what they are seeing, and then a plan of action evolves from that student study team meeting.
Okay, so, but wonder if the parent goes to the teacher and the teacher says, oh, the child will be fine, they'll just, they're just young and they'll get over this and they'll move.
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because oftentimes I think that the child sort of becomes the victim or is blamed. And sometimes the teachers will say to parents, if Johnny would just try harder, they could do a lot better. And so I think we have to be really careful about those kinds of things from the perspective of the teacher, and then again from the parent perspective, who might say, come on now, you can do better, you just are not trying hard enough. But sometimes there are real bona fide reasons that the child is struggling at school. And so I think it really behooves the teacher and the parent to find out why the child is struggling. And I think that the whole key here, Thelma, and if we don't get anything else out of this today, is early intervention. So if you take the teacher's word for it, sometimes I think, you might say no, and you really have to become that advocate for the child. Sometimes. Sometimes you have to go to the principal and say, my child is truly struggling, I really want to have a meeting. Put it in writing. I always think that paper trail is very important from both perspectives, the school and the parents' perspectives. And so that student study team should be held. And there's two ways. One of the two ways that emerge from that particular meeting, one of the things that happens is what we call an Rti response to intervention. And that's sort of a three-pronged approach. The first thing is that the teacher, the general education teacher, will try different things, modifications, different ways of teaching, etc., in the general ed classroom with no outside intervention to see if, those kinds of measures will help. And if that doesn't work, then somebody in the school system, such as myself, a special ed teacher, would then train with the teacher and give them ways that they could work in the classroom, in the general ed classroom still, and maybe even start to either push into the classroom and work with that child, or pull the child out to give them some specific instruction. But this is still not under the guise of special ed. They are not qualified as such. And I want to mention too that it's purported that there is a 6.8 million children between the ages of 3 to 21 that are actually receiving special ed services and related services as we speak today, which is an enormous amount. I think it's probably even larger, if the truth be told, because of the fact that some of these, as I think you and I are both aware, have not been yet diagnosed. Yes. Anyway, so the second way in which a child is actually diagnosed potentially for a learning disability is that a lot of information is gathered. And I think it has to be a whole child concept, not just the educational component. You and I, again, both know that the emotional component is huge in some children's learning, because you ask them to come to school and be prepared to learn. But if they're emotionally withdrawn, not there, then it's very difficult for the teacher to reach the child. So that really has to be taken into account, I think. So if the SST, the student study team, results in a potential whole battery of tests, etc., for a child to determine whether there's a learning disability, then several things take place. It would behoove the parent to go to the doctor, perhaps get hearing tested, you know, a full workup, because again, we're looking at the whole child concept here, and that is part of the child, obviously. Mm-hmm. So we need the doctor and the hospital, that sort of thing. We need an observer, somebody such as myself or a school psychologist would go in and observe the teacher and the interaction between the teacher and the child in the general ed classroom, so that we get that as part of it. And then the special ed teacher might give a psychoeducational battery of tests to determine the actual educational level of the child in terms of reading, writing, math, that sort of thing. And then the school psychologist will also do a battery of tests on the child. And then the parent oftentimes, especially if there might be potential ADD or ADHD, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, if that might be part of the issue, then the parents oftentimes fill out questionnaires, such as a Conners rating scale, where they simply have to tick the boxes in terms of how many times they see sort of symptoms.
Yes, very much so. How about, one of the questions I have for you, if a parent starts taking notes and sends a booklet to the teacher asking how did Johnny do today in school and what his reaction was because he had a bad morning or something like that, would that kind of give you more proof as to what's going on in the classroom and how he's adjusting?
Well, potentially so, but I think the more communication, you know, a teacher and a parent can have, obviously, so much the better. I would even recommend, and have done to parents, because I have a private tutoring business as well, and there I always suggest that those parents go in and actually observe their child in the classroom scenario to see what's going on and what they see. Because if a child is trying to maintain, oftentimes they can only maintain for a certain length of time, and after that they sort of resort to their own usual self, if you will. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that. But I wanted to sort of digress here for a minute. If all of the people gather the information and the testing is done in a 60-day time frame, which is the legal element, and I want to say that there's legal timelines, legal guidelines galore these days from the part of the school. So within a 60-day time frame, typically the special ed teacher will contact the parents, set up an individual educational plan meeting, at which time the parents will come and so will the other team members. And then the results of all the testing is then thoroughly discussed. It will be determined at that point if a child looks as though they have a learning disability, potentially of some description. And oftentimes, it might even lead to some further testing of some sort. It might lead to more at the doctor's office. It might lead to more from the perspective of maybe an occupational therapy evaluation, because that is one of the related services that is given in schools. So there's a lot of other services out there, physical therapy, adaptive PE. So there's lots of other screenings that can take place to determine whether a child is going to receive services or should receive services or not. And typically then we would hope that everybody would be on the same page with that, and that after that has happened, let's say hypothetically that a child actually does qualify for special education based on that. And I should also point out, the old way was that there had to be 22 points of a discrepancy between where the academic testing was done and the child's IQ. There had to be a 22-point discrepancy in order for a child to qualify. That, in my opinion, is a great thing, has been thrown out. And so we don't have to go by that anymore in order to qualify a child. So again, I think we go back to the right perspective, the one I've said for 20 years, by the way, and that is you look at that whole child. And what do you see? What makes that child tick? And what is stopping that child from progressing academically in the school setting? So if a child does qualify then, typically, if they're going to get services, it would be in the resource room with a teacher such as myself. Some people, and there's a lot of leeway here in terms of service delivery models. So some resource specialists might push into the classroom and help the child in the general ed classroom. Some will pull out in small groups and give directed instruction that way. And I think that as a case manager, then it has to be a sort of a multimodal approach, because there should be a lot of communication going on between the school, the parent, the general ed teacher. If there's any other services warranted, such as occupational therapy, that kind of thing, then that case manager's job is to keep everybody on the same page. Oftentimes, children with learning disabilities also need modified assignments in the classroom to be successful. They also need modified homework assignments to be successful as well. Because I've had parents, I can't tell you how many times, come to me and say, my son spent 3 hours and it was awful and we were both in tears. And so I'm always a proponent for, why are they doing all of that homework? Isn't it okay for a parent to say, okay, we worked on the prescribed 45 minutes, this is how much we got done, sign it off, and have this communication between the teacher and the parent that says it's okay. Because I think when a child is being stressed at school because they know they're not doing well, they look around and everybody else is doing great, and they look and they can't do it, then the worst thing you can do is ask them to go home after they've maintained all day and then continue the same kind of things at home. It doesn't lead to a good home life. It's very stressful for parents. So I think a lot of the learning disabilities that we see is not just isolated in the school, but it's that ripple effect into the home, into the siblings, a lot of those kinds of things. So I think we have to be really careful as to what we do for a child, and we make sure that we stay staunch advocates in the school and at home for these children, because that's what they need, in my opinion. And I know that you're more familiar than I with not the educational, but the emotional perspective of all of this and how that sort of interacts.
That's the sad part about these kids, because they're in school and the teacher's standing over them telling them, get this math, do this English, but the child might be thinking, where's my mom? because their mother has left them.
Right.
And the teachers don't know, you know, or dad's not around and they really feel they need it. Or even a small thing like the teacher wears a certain perfume and it reminds him of a mother who's just passed away. All of these things go through emotional, these children go through. And they have a very, very rough time sitting in a school for 6 hours a day.
Well, I know that the emotionally disturbed title, if you will, is given to those students who are then placed in a separate class, like a special day class. And there are a lot of those children out there these days. I think that those numbers are also on the increase.
They are, Jackie, and the sad part about it is these children who are emotional don't do well, even in a classroom of 15.
Right.
They are much better in a smaller classroom.
The smaller the better, I
The
quite
smaller the
agree.
better.
I think that's sort of an offshoot of how many children we have in special ed. I've talked with other people in the field and they've said, have you noticed that there are more and more students who are qualifying? Most decidedly, I'd noticed that. And also, the other fact is that the children that we do get to qualify these days are lower functioning than ever before. Ever before. And I think we throw into the mix then the fact that there are a lot of drug babies that a person such as myself would have in their classroom. And it's interesting because they have some commonalities, but then there are other things, other traits, if you will, from an academic perspective that are vastly different from the next one that might be sitting next to them in that class. So it's awfully difficult to be able to reach all of those children, but that is, of course, what a special ed teacher has to do. I wanted to mention, too, that if a child does qualify for special ed, they are then re-evaluated. Typically, the goals are written for a year, but I would recommend to parents that they check on that quite frequently, because a parent is legally permissible for a parent to request an IEP anytime that they so desire. I'm sure if they just gave 24 hours notice to the school, that would be fine then, that would be arranged. And so they can keep track of those goals that are written, the academic and social maybe goals for those child. And sometimes when behavior is an issue in there too, we add a behavioral plan to that IEP so that we're looking at all those various things. And it's an interesting mix these days because we also have a lot more autistic children and those with Asperger's syndrome in our classrooms, in the general ed population as well, potentially, because under that umbrella you have such a vast difference of intellectual capacity that it's quite amazing, still with that same label of autism, if you will. So that's another thing that we look at. And so there's a lot going on in the field of special education, but I would like to say, especially when it comes to autism, the one message that I could put in neon lights these days is early intervention is the key. Early intervention is the key for autism and also the key for any learning disabilities. I've been doing some work with a teacher who has 3-year-olds. And the day that they turn 3, if they've been recognized already and identified, then they are able to go into a class for those who have language delays. And I think I've seen some wonderful, wonderful things happen as a result of, again, early intervention. If we can get them at 3 or even before that age, it's great. The results are absolutely fantastic. So I would say to parents, if you have any concerns about your child and in terms of their language development, in terms of their learning development, that it's much better to be proactive than reactive. Because I think if you take your child to a doctor, if you take your child to somebody who can help you and take a look at language development, for example, so much the better, because as soon as you can do that, you'll be relieved and the child can get help And I really believe that's the way.
But also in the mental aspect, these children that are drug babies, sometimes where you expect them to get the vowels and the early math and all that, they don't get it until maybe their 3rd or 4th grade because they're slow. They're
or
very
maybe
slow.
not even at that point. Yes. Yeah, that's one of the things.
So is this something you're hoping to do with the Learning Inspiration Academy?
Yes, that's a new school that I'm forming, and I'm really excited about this because we're going to take small amounts of children, small numbers, and then from that small number be able to pull one at a time and give them instruction in specialized programs that are scientifically researched and based and are proven to work. And I have high hopes that we'll be able to bring these children back into line with the general ed population, such that if we had them for a year or two, they could then go back in and fit. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these children fitting in from an academic perspective. And obviously from a social emotional perspective, they're not going to fit in when they don't feel right at school. It's a bad experience for some of these children. So we need to do lots of different things for them. And sometimes parents do have to be staunch advocates. They really do, to be able to do this, because it isn't one size fits all in education. And I think that's where, potentially, again, my opinion, that society has gone awry. Because we do have a tendency, and have had a tendency, to try and do that. And so I think it's time that we look out of the proverbial box into very different kinds of approaches to education. Because I know that if you work with the right program, with the right child, with the right teacher, you can absolutely work miracles.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, there's so much that can be done for these children. So I think if the teacher has the perspective that, well, the child has a learning disability, so what can we do? Is there anything we can do? I think you never should set a cap or a ceiling on a child's educational perspective, because I think, and their potential, because I think that they can really and truly rise above it given the right educational format. That's what it's about.
We're running out of time, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about if the child doesn't meet the requirements for IEPs. What about a 504?
Right, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that too. A child, for example, who might have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder might not be doing as well as their potential might lead them to, because oftentimes these children are really bright children. And my approach to that is that if you can visualize a child sitting in a classroom of 30-something children these days, even from kindergarten, remember? Our classes are 30 in kindergarten now, Thelma. And I can visualize a child with ADD or ADHD with like a butterfly net. And they sit there, and then every so often, they get that butterfly net and get a little piece of information, but not enough to amount to anything. It's sort of their Swiss cheese approach to learning, because the rest of the time they're, somebody dropped a pencil, somebody turned a page, etc. And so they don't get a good solid base in terms of their education. And a thing like a 504 plan, which comes under the Americans with Disabilities Act, is really good for children who do not qualify for special ed, but need help and need lots of accommodation in the general education classroom alone. It is not special ed, and special ed personnel do not have anything to do with it. It is a general education move. Now that 504 is a plan of action that the teacher, the administrator, and the parent come together and formulate. And if it's an older child, the child would be a part of that too, such that the teacher then must, by law, adhere to that 504 plan. That 504 plan can then go to the junior high and the high school with that child. And I've also taught at a university campus, and I had somebody who came and said to me, I have ADD and I have a 504 plan. And so even in a university setting, I had to adhere to that 504 plan. So I think it's a really good move for those. My concern too is those who don't qualify for special ed by virtue of the fact that there isn't sufficient, if they're lower functioning, if you will. This is a real grey area that has yet to be addressed by the school system. But I guess maybe that's the next time we need to address those, do we?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, also wonder if my child didn't qualify, yet I went outside and had a study done, and it shows basically that he does. Can I present that to the school?
You could certainly present that to the school, but they are not bound to take that into consideration, I must tell you. They are not bound to do so. Also, if you have a whole battery of tests done and a child doesn't qualify for a learning disability, because remember, it's not the 22 points anymore, but if the school psychologist does not find any learning disability at that point in time, then obviously the parent has a right to appeal the decision.
Okay.
And when they're given, in fact, their parents' rights, which they must be by law, it does specify in those parents' rights the appeal process that they can go through. Gives them websites, gives them lots and lots of information. So that's how they could go about if they disagree with the school.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about our high school kids, because you and I deal with this. How important it is for the parent to be in touch with each one, especially of the major classes that the teacher is following through on the IEP.
Right, I think that's paramount, and it is very time consuming and very stressful for a parent to do this. But oftentimes, I think it has to be done, because you could have lots of good faith, and I'm certainly not teacher bashing as one, because teachers have an awful lot to do, awful lot to do, and a lot in the mix, as we've discussed today, a lot of variety in the mix today. But if by chance they do not adhere to the IEP, then the parent must become the advocate. The parent should be the one to call the IEP, get the whole team of teachers together, and you know, iron things out, find out. I think these days we have a lot of communication via technology with the internet, and also emails are fabulous. I would strongly suggest that a teacher the parent get every teacher's email, if they can, right at the beginning, at that IEP, at the beginning of the school year. And the parent needs to then go in at the beginning of the school year and say, my child, I want to make absolutely clear to you that my child has an IEP, this is what's on it, this is how it impacts him, etc., so that everyone starts off on that same page. And it should be, an IEP is a legal binding contract between the school and the parent and child, and so it must be approved, and then it should be adhered to, and if it's not, then something has to change so that it does.
And I think we have to remember that children in high school, you think that, they're in the 10th grade, they should be able to do some of this stuff themselves, but for their social and emotional, they are most of them are very immature for that age,
and a lot of them are not able, they're not able to self-advocate. Sometimes these, as you and I well know, these teachers don't know what, the students don't know what they don't know. Well,
we're going to cut it off, and we're going to thank Jackie for visiting with us today and giving us all the answers. Thank you again, Jackie.
You're very welcome.
Come back soon.
Oh, I would like to come back. I'm sure I could talk some more.